Section 55 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 5, by Henry Gray. Surface Anatomy of Upper Extremity, Part 1. Skin. The skin covering the shoulder and arm is smooth and very movable on the underlying structures. In the axilla there are numerous hairs and many sudoriferous and sebaceous glands. Over the medial side and front of the forearm the skin is thin and smooth, and contains few hairs but many sudoriferous glands. Over the lateral side and back of the arm and forearm it is thicker, denser, and contains more hairs but fewer sudoriferous glands. In the region of the olecranon it is thick and rough, and is very loosely connected to the underlying tissue, so that it falls into transverse wrinkles when the forearm is extended. At the front of the wrist there are 3 transverse furrows in the skin. They correspond respectively, from above downward, to the positions of the styloid process of the ulna, the wrist joint, and the midcarpal joint. The skin of the palm of the hand differs considerably from that of the forearm. At the wrist it suddenly becomes hard and dense and covered with a thick layer of epidermis. On the thenar eminence these characteristics are less marked than elsewhere. In spite of its hardness and density, the skin of the palm is exceedingly sensitive and very vascular, but it is destitute of hairs and sebaceous glands. It is tied down by fibrous bands along the lines of flexion of the digits, exhibiting certain furrows of a permanent character. One of these, starting in front of the wrist at the tuberosity of the navicular bone, curves around the thenar eminence and ends on the radial border of the hand a little above the metacarpophalangeal joint of the index finger. A second line begins at the end of the first, and extends obliquely across the palm to reach the ulnar border about the middle of the 5th metacarpal bone. A third line begins at the ulnar border about 2.5 centimeters distal to the end of the second, and extends across the heads of the 5th, 4th, and 3rd metacarpal bones. The proximal segments of the fingers are joined to one another on the volar aspect by folds of skin constituting the web of the fingers. These folds extend across about the level of the centers of the proximal phalanges, and their free margins are continuous with the transverse furrows at the roots of the fingers. Since the web is confined to the volar aspect, the fingers appear shorter when viewed from in front than from behind. Over the fingers and thumb the skin again becomes thinner, especially at the flexures of the joints where it is crossed by transverse furrows, and over the terminal phalanges. It is disposed on numerous ridges in consequence of the arrangement of the papillae in it. These ridges form, in different individuals, distinctive and permanent patterns which can be used for purposes of identification. The superficial fascia in the palm of the hand is made up of dense fibro-fatty tissue which binds the skin so firmly to the palmar aponeurosis that very little movement is permitted between the two. On the back of the hand and fingers the subcutaneous tissue is lax, so that the skin is freely movable on the underlying parts. Over the interphalangeal joints the skin is very loose, and is thrown into transverse wrinkles when the fingers are extended. Bones. The clavicle can be felt throughout its entire length. The enlarged sternal extremity projects above the upper margin of the sternum at the side of the jugular notch, and from this the body of the bone can be traced lateralward immediately under the skin. The medial part is convex forward, but the surface is partially obscured by the attachments of the sternocleido mastoideus and pectoralis major. The lateral third is concave forward, and ends at the acromion of the scapula in a slight enlargement. The clavicle is almost horizontal when the arm is lying by the side, although in muscular subjects it may incline a little upward at its acromial end, which is on a plane posterior to the sternal end. The only parts of the scapula that are truly subcutaneous are the spine and acromion, but the coracoid process, the vertebral border, the inferior angle, and to a lesser extent the axillary border, can also be readily defined. The acromion and spine are easily recognizable throughout their entire extent, forming with the clavicle the arch of the shoulder. The acromion forms the point of the shoulder. It joins the clavicle at an acute angle, the acromial angle, slightly medial to and behind the tip of the acromion. The spine can be felt as a distinct ridge, marked on the surface as an oblique depression which becomes less distinct and ends in a slight dimple, a little lateral to the spinous processes of the vertebrae. Below this point the vertebral border can be traced downward and lateralward to the inferior angle, which can be identified although covered by latissimus dorsi. From the inferior angle the axillary border can usually be traced upward through its thick muscular covering, forming with its enveloping muscles the posterior fold of the axilla. The coracoid process is situated about 2 centimeters below the junction of the intermediate and lateral thirds of the clavicle. It is covered by the anterior border of deltoideus, and thus lies a little lateral to the infraclavicular fossa or depression, which marks the interval between the pectoralis major and deltoideus. The humerus is almost entirely surrounded by muscles, and the only parts which are strictly subcutaneous are small portions of the medial and lateral epicondyles. In addition to these, however, the tubercles and a part of the head of the bone can be felt under the skin and muscles by which they are covered. Of these, the greater tubercle forms the most prominent bony point of the shoulder, extending beyond the acromion. It is best recognized when the arm is lying passive by the side, for if the arm be raised, it recedes under the arch of the shoulder. The lesser tubercle, directed forward, is medial to the greater and separated from it by the intertubercular groove, which can be made out by deep pressure. When the arm is abducted, the lower part of the head of the humerus can be examined by pressing deeply in the axilla. On either side of the elbow joint and just above it are the medial and lateral epicondyles. Of these, the former is the more prominent, but the medial supracondylar ridge passing upward from it is much less marked than the lateral, and as a rule is not palpable. Occasionally, however, the hook-shaped supracondylar process is found on this border. The position of the lateral epicondyle is best seen during semiflexion of the forearm, and is indicated by a depression. From it, the strongly marked lateral supracondylar ridge runs upward. The most prominent part of the ulna, the olecranon, can always be identified at the back of the elbow joint. When the forearm is flexed, the upper quadrilateral surface is palpable, but during extension it recedes into the olecranon fossa. During extension, the upper border of the olecranon is slightly above the level of the medial epicondyle, and nearer to this than to the lateral. When the forearm is fully flexed, the olecranon and the epicondyles form the angles of an equilateral triangle. On the back of the olecranon is a smooth triangular subcutaneous surface, and running down the back of the forearm from the apex of this triangle, the prominent dorsal border of the ulna can be felt in its whole length. It has a sinuous outline and is situated in the middle of the back of the limb above, but below, where it is rounded off, it can be traced to the small subcutaneous surface of the styloid process on the medial side of the wrist. The styloid process forms a prominent tubercle continuous above with the dorsal border, and ending below in a blunt apex at the level of the wrist joint. It is most evident when the hand is in a position midway between supination and pronation. When the forearm is pronated, another prominence, the head of the ulna, appears behind and above the styloid process. Below the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, a portion of the head of the radius is palpable. Its position is indicated on the surface by a little dimple, which is best seen when the arm is extended. If the finger be placed in this dimple and the semi-flexed forearm be alternately pronated and supinated, the head of the radius will be felt distinctly rotating in the radial notch. The upper half of the body of the bone is obscured by muscles. The lower half, though not subcutaneous, can be readily examined, and if traced downward is found to end in a lozenge-shaped convex surface on the lateral side of the base of the styloid process. This is the only subcutaneous part of the bone, and from its lower end the apex of the styloid process bends medialward toward the wrist. About the middle of the dorsal surface of the lower end of the radius is the dorsal radial tubercle, best perceived when the wrist is slightly flexed. It forms the lateral boundary of the oblique groove for the tendon of the extensor pollicis longus. On the front of the wrist are two subcutaneous eminences, one on the radial side, the larger and flatter, produced by the tuberosity of the navicular and the ridge on the greater multangular, the other on the ulnar side by the pisiform. The tuberosity of the navicular is distal and medial to the styloid process of the radius, and is most clearly visible when the wrist joint is extended. The ridge on the greater multangular is about 1 centimeter distal to it. The pisiform is about 1 centimeter distal to the lower end of the ulna, and just distal to the level of the styloid process of the radius. It is crossed by the uppermost crease which separates the front of the forearm from the palm of the hand. The rest of the volar surface of the bony carpus is covered by tendons and the transverse carpal ligament and is entirely concealed, with the exception of the hamulus of the hamate bone, which, however, is difficult to define. On the dorsal surface of the carpus only the triangular bone can be clearly made out. Distal to the carpus, the dorsal surfaces of the metacarpal bones, covered by the extensor tendons, except the fifth, are visible